Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The night Dean opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch, his heart dropped like a fruit too ripe for its stem. For 14 days, he had slept with one eye open, hoping the sound of a car door, the creak of the front gate, or the distant bark of a dog would announce her return. But every hope was a match that burned too fast and left only smoke. When the taller officer cleared his throat and said, "We found your wife," Dean's knees threatened to give way. Mariah, how Ben his Mariah, the mother of his two boys, the woman whose laughter once melted the frost off his worst days, had been found alive. Alive, but not whole. She was discovered by a dirt road near Maple Junction, tied at the wrists with bruises decorating her like tragic jewelry, lips cracked, hair matted like she'd crawled through a storm. Dean had pictured reunions, rehearsed his joy in mirrors laced with steam and sorrow. But as she lay in that hospital bed staring through him as if he were glass, something about her was not Mariah. The police had questions, but their eyes held more than curiosity. They held suspicion that hadn't found its voice yet. Even the nurse who wheeled her into the ward stole a glance too long, as if sensing something was offbeat in this symphony of survival. And Dean, whose soul had stretched and sagged under grief's weight, suddenly felt it tighten again. Not from sadness this time, but from a cold draft of unease he couldn't name yet. He watched his sons wrap their tiny arms around her waist while she flinched lightly, as though touched by fire and not love. No one else noticed, but Dean did, and his silence grew legs. That morning 2 weeks ago had seemed like any other, deceptively normal, quietly cruel. The scent of cinnamon toast lingered in the kitchen as sunlight slipped through the window blinds like golden ribbons. Mariah had worn that plum-colored blouse he always liked, her workid already dangling from her neck. She kissed Ezra on the forehead, promised Nolan they'd build a blanket fort after dinner, and turned to Dean with a smile that felt borrowed. "I'll be back early," she'd said, tossing her bag over her shoulder. "Big meeting, then I'm all yours." He'd watched her walk down the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks to a goodbye he didn't know was permanent. Hours passed like heavy luggage dragged through sand. Noon became dusk, dusk became worry, and worry birthed panic that paced the living room. Her phone rang straight to voicemail, once, twice, 10 times. He called her office. She left by 9, they said. He drove the route she always took, eyes darting to every shoulder, every alley, every parked car with shaded windows. When midnight came and Mariah didn't, Dean walked into the police station, voice hoarse from fear, skin cold from questions. The days that followed swallowed him whole. Friends came with casseroles, with prayers, with theories. Some whispered she ran. Others whispered he knew more than he said. But Dean said nothing. He held his boys, told them Mommy was okay, even when doubt chewed on his tongue like bitter cola. Every night he stared at her side of the bed, sheets still neat like they were waiting for her warmth. And every morning he folded them tighter, as though controlling creases could somehow control pain. When they found her, the story was quick to form like a rumor chasing fire. She said 2 men took her. She said they pushed her into a van outside Willow Street Plaza, bound her hands, blindfolded her eyes, and kept her in a room with no windows and a leaking ceiling. She didn't know the days. She said they fed her stale bread and water. She said they asked no ransom. She said they let her go without a word. Every sentence felt rehearsed, like a monologue she'd practiced in the dark. The police took her statement, jotted notes, nodded where appropriate. But behind closed doors, they analyzed the fibers found on her clothes, the subtle gleam of a ring that wasn't on her finger before she vanished. A female officer noted her toenails were freshly painted, not chipped or dirty as one would expect. The psychologist asked if she recalled any voices, any symbols, anything at all that could help track the abductors. Mariah blinked often, as if searching for the right emotion. She cried on cue. She touched Dean's hand gently, but her fingers felt hollow, like a glove without a hand inside. Dean wanted to believe her. He wanted to wrap her in forgiveness before he even unwrapped the truth. But deep down, his instincts itched. Not screamed, not roared. Just itched. Quietly. Constantly. Like a whisper behind the curtain. And so he watched her as one might watch a magician, amazed, but always suspicious that what you see is not what you get. Ezra began having night terrors. Nolan wouldn't sleep unless Dean lay beside him, rubbing his back in circles that never seemed to end. Mariah tried to pick up where life had paused. She folded clothes, repacked her work bag, made breakfast like before. But something had shifted, like a mirror with a hidden crack that still reflects but never truly whole. One evening, Dean found her in the backyard, just standing there, barefoot on the grass, staring into the distance. "You okay?" he asked gently. She smiled, a half-cooked thing that melted too fast. "Just needed air," she replied. But the way her arms were wrapped around herself said she was building a wall, not enjoying the breeze. Later that night, Dean sat at the dining table long after the lights were off. He stared at her untouched tea, the faint lipstick print on the rim. He remembered how she used to hum while stirring, how she always added a spoonful of honey and never sugar. That tea now sat cold, like an apology never spoken. Dean looked at the calendar. 2 weeks. 14 days of screaming silence. Something didn't add up. He picked up his phone, opened his notes, and started listing things that didn't feel right, not to accuse her, but to make sense of the chaos. The last thing he typed before closing his phone was, who were those men? But the better question, the one too heavy to write, was there ever anyone else at all? The call came just as dawn was curling its fingers around the town's windowsills. Officer Landon was halfway through his second mug of lukewarm coffee, already bracing for another shift of dead ends, when the 911 dispatcher's voice cracked through the silence like glass underfoot. A bystander, an early riser on his way to the railway junction, claimed he saw a woman tied up near a field where the fog still hung low like sleeping spirits. The officer didn't waste time. In less than 15 minutes, the cruiser rolled down the dirt path, headlights slicing through the mist like truth through a lie. There she was. A woman crumpled like discarded linen beside a rusting guardrail, her blouse torn at the shoulder, her face blotched and smeared with something between soil and sorrow. One shoe on, the other nowhere in sight. When Landon shone the torch closer and saw her lips tremble, her eyelids flutter, his gut twisted, not with empathy, but with something more dangerous, doubt. She looked like she'd been dragged through a field of nightmares, but her wrists weren't bleeding, just red. Her hair had that deliberate messiness some stylists charge for. Still, procedures had to be followed. She was scooped up and driven to Elmdale County General. Word spread like spilled ink in a school hall. They found her. She's alive. She escaped. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Reporters typed headlines before knowing the full story. But Mariah didn't say much, not at first. Her eyes stayed locked on things no one else could see. And when she did speak, her voice came out brittle, like dry leaves crushed under anxious feet. She claimed she had no clue where she was kept, no names, no details, just fragments of panic disguised as memory. Dean stood just outside the hospital room, his boys curled up on either side of him like twin bookends to his pain. Mariah was inside, staring at the ceiling tiles like they held scripture. He hadn't rushed to hold her the way people expected. There was relief, sure, but also a knot in his chest that refused to loosen. The boys had dashed to her the moment they saw her frame, arms thrown around her waist with the kind of faith only children can muster. She had smiled, a smile that floated but didn't land. Dean watched it all like someone eavesdropping on his own life. When she finally looked at him, really looked, there was a beat of recognition and something else. Hesitation, maybe. Or guilt wearing the perfume of fatigue. She told her story in the presence of the detective and the hospital social worker, voice low and hands folded neatly in her lap. She was taken on her way to work, she said. They pulled her into a car, maybe a van, blindfolded her. She was kept in a place she couldn't describe. They didn't speak much. No food for the first 3 days. She cried every night. She prayed. Then, just like that, they let her go. Dropped her by the roadside as though her pain had reached its expiry date. Dean listened, nodding where the others did, but inside, his heart played its own beat. Something about her cadence was too even, too polished. And why did she glance at the clock twice while narrating trauma, as though she had somewhere else to be? After the meeting, when they were alone in the room, he reached for her hand. It was warm, too warm, like hands that had known comfort, not captivity. Behind the curtains of official procedure, the police weren't clapping yet. They smelled something sour behind the tale's sugar. The lead investigator, Helena Brooks, ordered a forensic sweep. They combed through the clothes Mariah wore, swabbed under her fingernails, checked the rope fibers around her wrists. It was standard protocol, but Helena had been in the force long enough to know that truth often wore the same shoes as lies. They just walked in opposite directions. The results started arriving one piece at a time. The fibers on her blouse didn't match the area she was supposedly dumped in. The residue on her skin contained particles of household detergent. Even stranger, her blood pressure was stable, her hydration level fine, and her nails, though coated in dirt, bore the subtle gloss of clear polish. The medical examiner raised an eyebrow. Victims often showed dehydration, bruised ankles, cracked lips. Mariah had the face of a woman who had been inconvenienced, not tormented. Still, appearances could lie. So could fear. But science rarely did. Detective Brooks leaned back in her chair one evening, sifting through photographs of the crime scene. Then she made a call to the State Forensic Unit. Cross-reference any unidentified DNA found on her clothing. If there's a match, I want it by morning. And just like that, the investigation shifted from rescue to revelation. It was no longer about what had been done to Mariah. It was about what she had done. Dean returned home with Mariah and the boys 3 days later. Reporters had packed their vans by then, the story already losing its shine in the media spin cycle. The house was eerily unchanged, blankets still folded where Dean left them, the table set for a dinner that never happened. Mariah walked in quietly, like a guest unsure if she'd overstayed her welcome. The boys resumed their routines quickly, children being the miraculous creatures that they are. But Dean found himself watching her, too often, too closely. She moved through the house like someone tiptoeing through memory. Every now and then, he caught her texting with her screen tilted slightly away. Once, while unpacking a grocery bag, he saw a faint tan line on her ring finger where her wedding band once lived. She had said it was taken by the kidnappers, but Dean remembered that she never took that ring off, even in the shower. And now it was just gone, along with the certainty he once had about the woman beside him. That night, after putting the boys to bed, he sat outside on the porch with a notepad. He didn't write names. He wrote questions. One per page. What motel soaps leave traces on someone's skin? Why did she have no signs of hunger? Why did her tears feel like performance art? And the final one, scrawled in tired ink, if someone wanted to be found, would they really tie themselves too tightly? The porch light flickered, and for the first time he realized he was more afraid of the answers than the questions themselves. The lab report arrived on a rainy afternoon, unceremoniously tucked in a manila folder like it didn't hold the weight of revelation. Detective Helena Brooks flipped through it slowly, her eyes scanning each line, as though reading a foreign language she understood too well. Midway through the second page, she stopped. DNA, partial but distinct, had been extracted from a sweat residue found on the inner lining of the blouse Mariah had worn the day she was discovered. It didn't belong to her husband, nor to any of the search team. It belonged to a man already cataloged in the state's criminal database, a certain Blake Ransom, previously charged for aggravated assault but released after a plea deal. That name didn't appear in any of Mariah's statements. Not once. Helena let the silence in the room thicken like unspoken guilt. Her gut, already a seasoned compass, now had coordinates. She picked up the phone and called Blake's last known employer, a hardware store on Birch Avenue. He hadn't shown up in weeks. "No word," said the manager. "But he's been late before." The detective then contacted the cell tower agency. Within 2 hours, they confirmed Mariah's phone had pinged several times in a residential zone of Meadow Ridge, Blake's listed address, during the same 2-week period she was presumed missing. That wasn't coincidence. That was connection hiding behind convenience. Helena stood by the window, watching raindrops trace erratic paths down the glass, each one a metaphor for how truth finally leaks from lies when pressure builds. This case had started like a search for a broken woman. Now it was beginning to smell like a blueprint soaked in betrayal. Something told her they were only scratching the surface, and the real filth was buried beneath rehearsed tears and badly stitched stories. Blake Ransom was picked up that same evening at a rundown motel 6 blocks from his registered address. He didn't resist, didn't flinch, just raised his hands as though he knew the script and had finally reached the arrest scene. In the interrogation room, he looked like a man more exhausted than afraid, as though the lie had grown heavier than his own spine could carry. At first, he stuck to a threadbare version of ignorance. He hadn't seen Mariah in years, didn't even know she was missing, and the DNA must be some lab mistake. But when Helena slid the photo across the table, a time-stamped street cam still showing Mariah entering Blake's apartment at 8:14 a.m. on the morning she was kidnapped, the lie began to leak at the seams. "All right," Blake sighed, rubbing his temples like truth hurt. "We were together. I didn't force her. We planned it." His voice didn't carry triumph. It slouched in defeat. He explained that Mariah had reached out to him months ago, said she felt invisible in her marriage, said she wanted something that made her feel alive again. Then the idea, they'd fake her disappearance. Hideout. Give her the cover she needed to disappear for a while, spend time with him freely, and return with a story nobody would question. She said no one would suspect, Blake muttered. She knew exactly how to act when it was time. Helena sat back, folding her arms slowly. "And what changed?" Blake glanced at the floor. "She wanted to stay longer. I panicked. It was getting messy. Too many calls. I told her to leave. That's when she tied herself up and told me to drive her to the edge of town. It landed like a stone dropped into still water. The room didn't need more words. Just the echo of a man confessing not to love, but to collaboration." Back in Elmdale, Dean was assembling a Lego set with his sons when the call came. His hands were full of red and blue plastic bricks, his mind barely catching up to the reality that his wife was slowly readjusting to life at home. When Detective Brooks asked him to come down to the station for a conversation, he thought maybe they'd made progress in identifying the supposed kidnappers. He arrived, eyes puffy from sleepless nights and too much caffeine, still holding hope like a fragile egg. But the minute he entered the room and saw Helena's face, stoic, almost apologetic, he felt something heavy pressed down on his ribs. "Dean," she began gently, "we've discovered evidence that Mariah was not abducted." She spent those 2 weeks willingly with a man named Blake Ransom. We have a confession, GPS data, phone records, DNA. We believe she staged her own disappearance. The words were knives, and each syllable sliced deeper than the last. Dean didn't speak. He didn't ask for proof. He just sat down, numb, staring at his calloused hands like he was trying to remember what they used to hold besides disappointment. The woman he'd loved, protected, defended, had manufactured an entire trauma to cheat freely. It was betrayal dressed in victimhood, and that irony bit deep. We'll need to bring her in, Helena continued. But you deserve to know first. Dean nodded slowly. Outside, the wind blew against the glass, tapping softly as if asking permission to howl. But inside, all was quiet, the kind of quiet that fills a man's soul after trust has been burned to ash. The next morning, the knock on the door was lighter than it had been 2 weeks prior, when 2 officers came with news of Mariah's return. This time, it was quieter, more final. Mariah opened the door in her robe, cup of tea in hand, steam still rising like lies that hadn't cooled. She looked confused at first, then caught sight of Helena's badge and said nothing, just stepped back and let them in. Dean stood by the staircase, arms folded, watching it all unfold like a scene he'd already seen in his sleep. Mariah Ransom, the officer said, deliberately using her maiden name, you are under arrest for filing a false police report, obstruction of justice, and misuse of public emergency resources. She didn't protest, didn't cry. Just placed her tea down gently like she didn't want it to spill and held out her wrists. Ezra peeked from the top of the stairs, his small voice asking, "Where's Mommy going?" Dean's lips parted, but the words refused to come out. Later that day, as news quietly broke, neighbors whispered with knitted brows. Some said she was desperate. Others said she was wicked, but Dean said nothing. Not to the police, not to reporters, not even to his own reflection. That night, he sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, thinking how betrayal never knocks. It picks the lock and walks right in wearing your favorite face. The silence in the house was no longer the kind that held space for return. It was the kind that settled in like dust, marking absence with every breath. Dean stopped counting the hours since Mariah's arrest. There was no point. Time had become a blurry stream he stood in the middle of, too numb to move, too grounded in disbelief to swim out. The boys were back from school, their laughter not quite reaching the corners of the living room the way it used to. Ezra asked if Mommy had gone on another trip. Nolan, too young to understand betrayal but old enough to feel the shift, clung to Dean's side more than usual. Dean didn't know how to explain that the woman they both loved, the one who tucked him in with kisses and tales of faraway lands, had been telling a story of her own, a fiction steeped in disloyalty. The ring she once wore now sat in the drawer beside old receipts and a baby tooth from Ezra's first visit from the Tooth Fairy. Dean hadn't touched it since she left, but he opened that drawer every night as if expecting the truth to crawl out and say sorry. Neighbors kept their distance, some out of sympathy, some out of suspicion, and a few simply because they didn't know where to file this kind of mess in their minds. Was Mariah a villain? A victim? A misguided woman seeking thrill? Dean didn't care how the world defined her anymore. What mattered was how she'd redefined him, without warning, without mercy. The arraignment hearing was brief, but it cracked open wounds that hadn't even started scabbing. Mariah stood in the dock, hair neatly pulled back, eyes steady like someone rehearsing regret. Her lawyer advised her to say little, plead not guilty, let the process play its game. Dean sat in the back, away from cameras, holding a thin folder filled with documents he hadn't yet read. Bank statements, call logs, social media screenshots, little pieces of her scattered truth. Each paper felt like a whisper from a stranger. During a break, her eyes scanned the courtroom and landed on him. For a moment they locked, and in that space between them too many things floated: blame, apology, pride, and something else that looked like fear. Not the kind of fear that trembles. It was the kind that calcifies, that knows the damage is done and wonders if there's anything worth salvaging. He didn't blink, just looked at her as one would stare at a painting they once loved, only to later discover the artist had forged their name. Outside the court, reporters spewed theories like loose cannons. Some speculated a mental breakdown. Others claimed midlife crisis. Dean said nothing. Let them paint her story however they wanted. His version lived quietly in the way he now held his sons tighter before bed, and how he avoided the grocery aisle with her favorite cereal, and how he now slept with the lights on, not out of fear, but because shadows reminded him too much of her absence. Back at home, life continued, but with a limp. Dean didn't throw out her clothes, didn't box up the photo albums, but he did change the bedsheets, choosing a color she never liked, navy blue. It was a silent rebellion, a way of reclaiming space without burning bridges the boys might someday want to cross. Ezra found her old scarf one evening while looking for crayons and asked if they could send it to her. Dean paused, heart snagged between protection and truth. "We'll keep it here for when she comes back," he said, the lie sitting on his tongue like a stone. That night, he walked into the kitchen and opened the wine she had bought for their anniversary. It had collected dust beside the blender, a bottle once meant to toast love now poured to drown its ghost. He took one sip, then another, then left the glass half full and walked out to the porch. The moon was sharp, watching him like a witness. He sat there for hours, not moving, just listening to the quiet hum of a world that didn't care about heartbreak. Somewhere deep in the night, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry. Tell the boys I love them. Please." No name. But he didn't need one. He deleted it. Not out of anger, but because some wounds shouldn't be acknowledged by the same hand that caused them. Mariah spent her nights in the county holding cell with a thin blanket and the sound of steel doors clicking like judgments being made behind her back. She shared space with women whose crimes ranged from petty theft to assault, and for once she was just another face behind bars. The guards treated her like everyone else, no pity, no malice. She lay on her bunk staring at the flickering light above her, trying to piece together how desire had dragged her so far from the woman she once was. Blake hadn't visited, hadn't written. Cowardice had a way of vanishing when consequences pulled up a chair. She didn't blame him. She blamed herself for thinking freedom was something you could fake your way into. Each morning she folded her blanket, ate her toast, answered questions. But at night, when everything went still, her thoughts became loud. She remembered Ezra's tiny hands, Nolan's crooked smile, Dean's quiet strength. And yet, she also remembered the thrill of disappearing, of being someone else, even if just for a moment. The weight of it all settled in her stomach like uncooked rice, hard and digestible. When the cell lights dimmed and the buzz of the corridor faded, she whispered into the darkness, not sure who she was speaking to. Maybe God. Maybe guilt. Maybe both. "I didn't mean to lose everything," she said aloud, voice cracking like glass under weight. But the truth was, she hadn't lost everything. She'd taken pieces of the people who loved her, folded them into a lie, and left them behind like unpaid bills. And now, even silence refused to sit beside her kindly. The days after the arraignment bled into one another like colors too tired to stay inside the lines. Dean no longer looked at the calendar. Dates had lost meaning. Mornings came not with birdsong, but with the low hum of routine, getting the boys dressed, packing school bags, brushing crumbs off counters, and pretending the house didn't echo every time they mentioned her name. He hadn't told them the truth. How could he? How do you explain to children that their mother staged her disappearance like a play with no curtain call? He told them she was away, that grown-ups make mistakes, and that love can be complicated. But that explanation wore thin with each passing day, like shoes too small for growing feet. Ezra had started drawing pictures of their family, always omitting Mariah, as if his young heart had decided to edit reality faster than Dean could explain it. Nolan, on the other hand, cried often at night, whispering "Mommy" in his sleep, like a song whose chorus he couldn't forget. Dean did his best, but even superheroes need sleep, and his body was beginning to betray him. He once woke up on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., spoon still in his hand, oatmeal congealed in the pot. The house was spotless, but hollow, like a museum that no longer opened its doors. In moments of stillness, he found himself talking to her, not out loud, but in the kind of silence that asked questions and begged for answers. Why didn't she say something? Why didn't she just leave if she was unhappy? Why did she have to pretend to be lost when all she wanted was to be found in another man's arms? Meanwhile, Mariah sat through court-mandated therapy like someone observing a play she couldn't afford to miss. Her therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Kira Langdon, asked questions that danced around shame, trauma, and motive, but Mariah remained tight-lipped, offering only the kind of answers that sounded like they'd been borrowed from books. I felt unseen. I needed space. I wasn't thinking straight. But Dr. Langdon had years of sifting through confessions that sounded too neat. She once asked Mariah to describe the first time she realized she no longer recognized herself. Mariah had stared out the window for a full minute before saying, "The night I left, I didn't even cry. I just felt free." The honesty of it made her sick. Therapy became less about healing and more about holding a mirror to herself, one that showed all the jagged parts she had tried to hide under makeup, matching outfits, and calculated apologies. Blake had stopped contacting her completely. She heard from one of the officers that he was out on bail, laying low until the dust settled. Cowardice, she realized, had a scent. It smelled like sweat and old excuses. She had banked on the idea that she could slip back into her life like a foot into an old shoe, but now even her memories pinched. She thought of Dean often, of the way he used to watch her from across the dinner table, his gaze not possessive but present. She had once drowned in that kind of love, and still convinced herself she was dry. The irony was too bitter to swallow. Elmdale moved on, as towns do. Scandals had expiration dates, and the gossip wheel spun faster when something new came along. A city councilman's affair, a bakery fire, a football team scandal. Soon, Mariah's name wasn't on every lip, but the imprint of her betrayal lingered like perfume on a borrowed scarf. Some neighbors still looked at Dean with pity. Others avoided his gaze entirely, afraid their curiosity might look like cruelty. But he wasn't interested in pity. He found a strange comfort in the quiet, washing dishes, mowing the lawn, helping Ezra with homework. Even his grief had started wearing softer shoes. Still, there were reminders. The jasmine bush she planted by the mailbox bloomed late one afternoon, and he stared at it until the sun disappeared. The smell used to be her favorite. He didn't cut it down, but he didn't water it either. One weekend, he took the boys hiking. The forest was thick, the trail narrow, but for the first time in weeks, he breathed fully. On the way back, Ezra said, "It feels good to be gone for a while." Dean nodded, unable to explain how sometimes being gone becomes more comforting than being found. That night, he stood on the balcony, watching lightning claw across the sky. Somewhere in the dark, thunder echoed the way anger does when there's no one left to yell at. He whispered a single sentence to the air, one he hadn't said aloud until then. "I loved you the whole time." It didn't echo back, but he didn't need it to. Mariah's plea deal came with conditions: community service, probation, and a requirement to attend 6 months of counseling. She took the deal not because she was sorry, but because she was tired. She volunteered at a local shelter, folding donated clothes and avoiding eye contact. No one there knew her story, and for the first time in months, she wasn't being watched, judged, or pitied. It felt strange to be invisible again, but this time, It was earned. One afternoon, a child at the shelter hugged her unexpectedly and said, "You look like someone who used to be happy." It knocked the wind from her chest. On her way home, she walked past a bakery she once loved and stared through the window like a stranger. She imagined Dean baking bread with the boys, laughter rising like steam, untouched by her absence. She missed them, but she didn't reach out. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had finally understood that love, once cracked, rarely rings the same. Her therapist once asked what she'd say to Dean if she had one last moment with him. "I'd say I didn't know how to stop wanting more," Mariah replied, "and I'm sorry I looked for it in the worst possible way." But she never sent that message. Some apologies were better written in journals than spoken aloud. That night, she sat alone on her bed, flipping through a family photo she had kept tucked in her wallet. Her eyes lingered on Ezra's gap-toothed grin, then Nolan's soft curls, and finally Dean's half-smile. She traced her fingers across their faces and whispered, "I hope someday you remember me for something better than this." It had been 5 months since the arrest, and the air in Elmdale had begun to feel less heavy, like a wound that still ached but had stopped bleeding. Dean no longer checked his phone for missed messages or stared at the front gate each time the wind rattled it against the post. There was a new rhythm to his life, one stitched from small, unremarkable moments. Ezra tying his shoelaces without help, Nolan learning to read full sentences, the three of them laughing at Saturday morning cartoons with dry cereal in their palms. The house, once humming with the sounds of shared mornings, now pulsed with a quieter, sturdier beat. Dean had grown leaner, not from loss, but from motion. He took long walks in the evenings, sometimes with the boys, sometimes alone, and always through streets that had seen the full arc of his heartbreak. There were nights he still lay awake, staring at the ceiling like it held answers in invisible ink, but the pain had changed shapes, less like fire, more like the memory of it. One rainy afternoon, he opened a storage box and found an old video camera they used to film birthdays. He played a clip, Mariah dancing with Nolan, her laughter sharp and unfiltered, the kind that didn't need permission. He smiled, but only with his eyes. Then he closed the box, locked it, and slid it back under the bed. Some memories are like matches, beautiful to strike, but dangerous to keep lit for too long. He no longer hated her. But forgiveness was a house still under construction, and he wasn't ready to hand her the keys. Mariah had completed 78 hours of her court-ordered community service, and with each shift, her steps grew heavier, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of reflection. Folding clothes for strangers who knew nothing about her felt safer than facing the ones who did. The city no longer whispered when she walked by. They'd simply learned to speak without turning their heads. She worked at the shelter in silence, her hands busy, her eyes distant. There were moments when she'd catch herself humming, songs from a different life, notes that once lived in the kitchen while pancakes browned and the boys danced in pajamas. One evening, she overheard two volunteers discussing their spouses. One said, "When he's quiet, I worry he's hiding something. But when he's loud, I wish he'd hush." Mariah smiled faintly. She used to think Dean's quietness was a form of emotional distance. Now she knew it was depth, an ocean she had mistaken for a puddle. During therapy sessions, she began speaking more. Not to be heard, but to be understood. She admitted she hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, only to feel something that reminded her she was still alive. Her therapist told her that regret was an honest compass, but only if one had the courage to follow it all the way through. So she wrote letters. Not to sin, but to say the things her mouth was too cowardly to deliver. One for Dean. One for each child. She kept them in a small box beside her bed, promising herself she wouldn't send them until they could be received without reopening wounds. Healing, she'd learned, was not a sprint but a climb, slow, steep, and often lonely. The judge's final ruling came quietly on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between two petty theft cases and a property dispute. Mariah's probation was extended, her record marked but not destroyed, and she was free to resume her life within the limitations set by the law. She walked out of the courthouse not with relief, but with a hollowness she hadn't expected. Freedom, it seemed, was more than the absence of handcuffs. It was the presence of truth, of trust, of a life lived without masks. She didn't go back to the house. She knew better. Some doorways were not meant to be crossed twice. Instead, she moved into a small rental flat near the edge of town, a space with creaky floors and thin walls, but enough room for solitude to sit comfortably. On weekends, she baked. It started as a distraction, then became a ritual. Bread, cookies, sometimes meat pies. She would wrap them in old newspaper and take them to the shelter. No one asked who made them, but the smile said enough. One Friday evening, while dusting the flour from her apron, she paused by the window and saw Dean across the street. He was walking with the boys, Ezra skipping stones by the curb, Nolan clinging to his father's fingers. They didn't see her, or maybe they did and chose not to. She stepped back, heart pounding, unsure if it was from fear or longing. For a brief moment she wondered what it would feel like to open the door, to wave, to speak. But some distances can't be crossed in one lifetime. She stood there until they disappeared around the corner, then sat down and whispered a prayer, not for reunion, but for peace. Ezra turned 7 that December, and Dean organized a small gathering in the backyard, stringing up old fairy lights and borrowing extra chairs from a neighbor. Nolan helped decorate the cake with more sprinkles than frosting, and the children ran in circles until dusk colored the sky in lavender hues. After the party, once the last balloon had deflated and the final juice box was tossed, Dean sat alone under the canopy, watching his sons fall asleep on a blanket beside the fire pit. He didn't cry, not because he had no reason to, but because joy had finally learned to live beside sorrow without picking a fight. In the silence, he thought of Mariah, not with bitterness, but with a complicated fondness. She had, in her own tragic way, shown him the shape of his own resilience. The pain she caused carved a space inside him that had now filled with laughter, patience, and clarity. He didn't know where she was or what she did with her days, and he no longer needed to. His healing wasn't dependent on her return, nor was his peace built on her apology. It had taken months, but he now understood that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you decide to take when the story has said all it can say. That night, as he carried the boys to their beds, he tucked them in with a tenderness unshaken by absence. Then he stepped outside, breathed in the cool air, and said aloud to the stars above, "Let this be enough." And for the first time in a long time, it truly was. Not every betrayal comes with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face you once loved, speaking in the tone you trusted most. If someone walks out of your truth to live in their lie, let them go. Protect your peace. Remember, healing is not weakness, and starting over doesn't mean you've lost. It means you chose yourself over confusion. Keep your heart soft, but guard it like treasure. May the doors that open in your life never be ones that welcome deceit. May your eyes see clearly, even when your heart is full. I pray that peace will wrap itself around your home like a warm shawl on a cold night. May every heartbreak lead you closer to wholeness, and may your strength rise in quiet places. I speak joy into your mornings, laughter into your evenings, and wisdom into your choices. May loyalty find you. May love that is real stay. And may you never be fooled by what only pretends to care. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.